The next speaker we have who's going to present is Sonia Ravindranath Waddell. Sonia Ravindranath Waddell is Vice President and Economist for Regional and Community Analysis at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Sonia joined the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond's Research Department in January of 2008 and has responsibility for the regional and community development research areas within the department, including setting strategic direction for various data products, surveys, and other regional and local analysis. In addition, Sonia directs the incorporation of regional information into Federal Open Market Committee policy preparation for the Richmond Fed. Her work involves analyzing economic trends, writing for a variety of publications, and presenting on regional and national economic conditions. Prior to joining the Richmond Fed, she worked as an economist in the Virginia Department of Planning and Budget and at ICF International in Washington, D.C. She received a BA from Williams College in 2001 and an MS in Applied Economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2006. So, Sonia, without further ado, you can please start presenting. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Kritika. So, I started, as Kritika mentioned, I started at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in January of 2008, 2 months before Bear Stearns collapsed. So this is an interesting time in the economy. I'm not sure that I have been at the Fed for an uninteresting time, but I'm going to talk today about the U.S. and I'm going to weave Virginia into that and talk about sort of where we are in this recovery. There are a lot of themes that connect back to what Leah and Brian have talked about. Bus drive, needing to use National Guardsmen for bus driving, challenges in the food supply chain, even just GDP. So economic activity is back to pre-COVID levels, but I'll show you the overall GDP number, and that includes federal government spending, right? So certainly some percentage of the, I don't want to say anomalies, but some of the interesting things that we're seeing related to, kind of strong demand and GDP being back above where we were, but employment not being back above where we were, the labor shortages that a lot of firms are talking about. I mean, it connects back to some of the federal government spending for sure. So, okay, so where are we right now? So GDP is back to pre-COVID levels. Consumer spending is still strong. Very recently, in the last couple of months, we've seen some decline in the measures of confidence from the consumer side as well as from the business side. And I've got some theories as to why we see that, at least on the business side. And it goes beyond really the Delta variant. Employment is recovering, but we have job postings at record highs, but yet we're not back to where we were pre-COVID with respect to employment. This is nationally and in Virginia. And businesses across industries are reporting labor shortages and are increasing wages. So how do we square these things? I'll talk a little bit about that. And then price growth. So I had to choose what to talk about. I've got a couple of slides on price growth. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, so this is GDP. It's our broadest measure of economic activity at the national level. This is the quarterly change. GDP grew 6.3% in the first quarter of this year and 6.7% in the second quarter of this year. The red diamonds are the projections of the Federal Open Market Committee participants, actually the median projection of the Federal Open Market Committee participants when they made those projections in September. So most, and those are like annual projections. So most of the, let me also say the boxes around with a range of projections of those, somewhere between 15 and 19 people, depending on what day we are, how many people actually currently sit on the FOMC. So the expectation is certainly for slower growth in the third quarter. So I said 6.3% in the first quarter, 6.7% in the second quarter. I think most expectations are somewhere between 1% and 3% in the third quarter, and then have it pick up again in the fourth quarter. So, anticipated to have, growth for 2021 that's around 6% plus or minus. So this is the actual level of GDP. In some ways, this is easier to look at. So I've been doing these presentations for, a really long time now. And the this is not a chart that was particularly interesting before March of 2020. And in fact, a lot of the charts that we've used to understand changes, we've had to change because of the dramatic nature of what we experienced in 2020. So if you look at sort of I told you I started at the Fed in January of 2018. If you look at the Great Recession, and it was called the Great Recession for a reason, that was a large decline in economic activity, and it was completely dwarfed by what we saw in the second and third quarters of last year. But then we bounced back much more quickly. You can see how long it took us to get back to pre-Great Recession economic activity, and we have surpassed that now. So it's been a really really dramatic 18 months. So consumer spending is about 2/3 of this number, and that has been a very strong contributor to GDP growth. Spending on goods is well above pre-COVID levels. Spending on services is still below, but it is growing. So now that number is about 1.5% below where we were pre-COVID. And a lot of it, we have now savings rates that are at really high levels. We have high levels of disposable personal income. A lot of this is with the higher earners, like Brian was talking about. And a lot of higher earners did not see the hit to their income in 2020 that a lot of the lower earners did. And we'll see that when we look at the employment that has been the most affected. But I think that's a really important dynamic as we think about sort of how we've come through the last 18 months. Okay, so very recently, these are two measures of consumer sentiment. The dark blue one is one that comes out of a survey by the University of Michigan, and the red one is Consumer Confidence, the Conference Board. And you can see, these did not come back in quite the same way that a lot of the business optimism indices did, but they have fallen recently, as have some of the business optimism indices. So this is a survey that was started by Duke like 25 years ago, survey of CFOs, completely unrelated to COVID. It became a joint product of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and Duke in the second quarter of 2020. We since the time, so that's what that vertical line is. So in the interest of sort of academic integrity, I keep that line in there because technically we changed the question very slightly, or we changed the information that we gave participants, but I wouldn't show the time series if I didn't think that it was broadly comparable. And you can see that we had this increase in optimism really since we took over the survey. Again, unrelated to the fact that it became a joint product. And then in this last quarter that was just released last week, we saw a decline there. This is true for our indices too. So this is the light blue line is a measure that is developed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond out of a survey of manufacturers, a monthly survey of manufacturers. It's a diffusion index, so it's the share that say that things are better minus the share that say that things have been worse over the last month. And actually, it's a 3-month moving average. So what you can't really tell from this chart is that the September number for that light blue actually fell a little bit below zero, which it was not enough below zero to really think that more people are saying that things are worse than last month, but enough to think that it's sort of flat from last month. And then the dark blue line is a similar measure done by the Institute for Supply Management. They scale theirs by 50. So while for us, anything below zero indicates contraction, anything above zero indicates expansion, for them, that number is 50. But I'll say that, we also asked for comments, and about, maybe 25 to 35% of respondents comment each time. And the most common comments are not around the Delta variant or reduced revenues. It's about labor availability, it's about supply chain challenges, and it's about cost increases. It's about using National Guardsmen to drive buses and struggling to find the food that you need in school systems. So for example, a Virginia textile manufacturer said that supplier lead times increased significantly during COVID and have not adjusted. Materials continue to have a 5 or 6 week lead time compared to pre-COVID at 2 to 3 weeks maximum. Vendor pricing has increased significantly. and lead times are increased due to the loss of labor and no qualified applicants to replace the lost labor. A North Carolina furniture manufacturer said that supply chain issues continue to hamper our ability to produce, and now we are having major trucking issues with the carriers unable to handle the volume of furniture. Price increases continue to erode margins. So we do get some comments about the Delta variant reducing demand, but not much. Or actually the Delta variant sort of COVID broadly making it more difficult to produce goods because you have to deal with sort of plant closures and but you know, that has not been most of what we've heard in the last couple of months. And this is true for the service sector as well. So this is a similar measure done for the service sector. Oh, and I should have said, so the Fifth Federal Reserve District includes Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, most of West Virginia, and DC. I think I said that in the most random state order that I've ever done. So actually, Virginia and North Carolina make up the majority of the respondents here. We have a lot of Virginia and we have a lot of North Carolina. So the service sector, again, light blue, this is a revenues index. The other one was sort of a composite of a couple measures, but here too, we're seeing some softening. Here, a lot of the comments are around challenges finding workers, like almost all of them are, but we do get some about supply chain challenges for a technology supplier or some retailers. And here we get some demand decline more than in manufacturing. Cancellations have been commented on by hotels and event planners. And in fact, when we do surveys of firms, like we'll ask some extra questions. And not too long ago, we asked sort of how firms were dealing with the changing environment. And we got some vaccine mandates and we got some sort of increased or adjusted COVID protocols, but a lot of what we heard was canceling in-person gatherings. I don't know about you all, but we are not, I am actually in the office today, but we're not fully back in the office. We were supposed to be in September and now I think we're moved to January like a lot of other people. Okay, so I mentioned that that GDP is back above the pre-COVID level of activity. Employment is not. So this is non-farm payroll employment for the U.S. We added 194,000 jobs in September. Both August and September job gains were below what many were expecting. So I think the range of expectations were more like 400 to 500,000 for September. Now, I'll say the private sector actually added 317,000 jobs in September. I think that's the number we probably want to look at more than the 194,000 jobs because, you know, every June, a lot the way that we classify data here, we do have an education and health services sector, but public school teachers are in local government. And so every June, July, we see this decline in local government employment if you look at things that are not seasonally adjusted, and then every September we see this increase. So the seasonal adjustment will account for that. Well, we didn't see the decline in June and July because a lot of teachers are sort of kept on staff through the summer because of COVID. And then so we didn't see the same increase in September. So the series just, maybe this is too wonky and everyone's asleep by now, but the series just looks sort of funny right now. So I really think we want to think about that 317,000 jobs. But even if we do that, it's still below where the expectations were. So we are still a little over 3% below pre-COVID employment as a nation, which is, you know, a little over 3 million jobs. And like I said before, the pandemic continues to, it did hit sectors very unevenly and continues to hit sectors unevenly. So the light blue is the jobs lost during COVID. I know it looks positive, but so for example, we lost over 8 million jobs in leisure and hospitality from February to April. We are now, the dark blue is sort of how far below we are now. So we're now about 1.6 million jobs down in the leisure and hospitality sector compared to before COVID. So that's one takeaway from this chart, right? Leisure and hospitality is still the farthest from zero in that dark blue line, but you know, other sectors are too. Education, health services, for example, is still below where we were pre-COVID. And then transportation and warehousing, or some other sectors, including transportation and warehousing, are actually above their pre-COVID levels. This is similar, you know, the trend in the US is similar to that in Virginia. So Where the US is a little over 3% below pre-COVID though, Virginia is still down 4.4%. So that's 178,000 fewer jobs than we had as a state in the fall of 2020. We are having historic budget surpluses, as has already been discussed, and payroll withholding, grew in the state from the last report that I saw. A lot of these jobs are actually in the lower income sectors, right? So from March to April, I still have to share these numbers because they still shock me, even no matter how much I talk about them. From March to April of 2020, the leisure and hospitality industry in Virginia shed just about 50% of its workforce. Now, a lot of that has come back. But if you look at like professional business services, this is the largest and the highest paying sector in Virginia, and it's more or less back to normal. In fact, it is back to normal, more or less. But the leisure and hospitality sector is not. So if you look at like wages, for example, if you look at average weekly wages across these sectors, maybe I should have put in this chart, but the leisure and hospitality is less than half of whatever's next, which I think might be education, health services. So it is a lot of the lower wage jobs that have not come back yet. And we can, we can talk a little bit about why. And like I said, I'm happy to take questions. Okay, so the unemployment rate, as expected, fell below 5% in September to 4.8%. So we are still above, this is US again, we are still above where we were in February 2020, but this has been a pretty steep unemployment rate decline. So the red dots again are the median projections of the FOMC participants about where unemployment rate will be at the end of each year, and then the box is the range. As you can see, we're more or less we're more or less already at what was predicted for 2021. Now, importantly, this is the unemployment rate. So it's the number of people who were not working at the time of the survey and had not looked for work in the last 4 weeks, divided by those people plus the people who are working, right? So which is the labor force, right? So the people who are not working and have looked in the last 4 weeks, plus the people who are employed, is the labor force. And so this is the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. So, I'm going to talk about the share of the population that's actually in the labor force in a minute. For now, let me leave you with this number. So as a nation, we still have 7.7 million unemployed people. This is about 2 million more unemployed than we had pre-pandemic. So I'm going to leave you with that 2 million for a minute. Virginia has tended to run an unemployment rate below the US generally, and we still are. So 4% unemployment in Virginia. Now, this is August, actually. We don't get September numbers until the end of this week. But Virginia is highly educated. We have a diverse industry base. We have the federal government presence in Northern Virginia. So we tend to run a lower unemployment rate. But I'm gonna caveat that in a minute. Okay, so the labor force participation rate. So I left you with the 2 million more unemployed than pre-COVID, but if you are not working and have not looked for work in the last 4 weeks, then you're just out of the labor force. Now, there are ways that the Bureau of Labor Statistics sort of categorizes people, and there are different measures of unemployment that you can look at. But the unemployment rate, that 4.8% in September in the US, or the 4% in August in Virginia, those are the numbers that tend to get reported in the news and that people know. So this is the labor force divided by the population. So this rate was 61.6% in September. And in fact, it hasn't changed that much in the last year. So we recovered from the spring of 2020 drop by the summer of 2020. I mean, we did as much recovery as we were gonna do, and now we're sort of more or less bouncing around there. So this is 3 million more people out of the labor force than were in the labor force in February of 2020. So I had said 2 million more unemployed, 3 million more out of the labor force. That's 5 million fewer workers now than we had in February of 2020. So the question is, where are these people? Let me talk about Virginia, and then I can talk a little bit about that, but there's some open question to that. Okay, so the Virginia labor force participation rate tends to run higher than the US, and the unemployment rate tends to run lower, right? So unlike some other states in our district, like West Virginia has had the lowest labor force participation rate in the country for as long as I can remember, at the very least for the last 15 years. And South Carolina also tends to be on the lower side. Virginia is on the higher side, really, of the nation and also of the district. But if you look at that participation rate since COVID, right? So it dropped, it sort of came back up, but then it started to fall again. And we're now below where we were in like April of 2020. So after being 66.3% in February of 2020, it's now at 62.9%. Okay, so let me explain a little bit about why this matters to that sort of overall unemployment rate. So if you look at the labor force participation of February 2020, it's sort of where it should be, which I'm not saying that you should do, and I can talk about why you might want to not want to do that, but let's just say that that's where we should be as a state. And we take those people that are not in the labor force and we kind of count them as unemployed. We would end up with an unemployment rate in the state not of 4%, but of close to 9%. If you do the same for the US, you get not 5.2% in August. Again, I'm sticking the US in August because that's where Virginia is. So not 5.2%, but 7.5%. In other words, where the Virginia unemployment rate was 1.2 percentage points below the US, it actually becomes like 1.4 percentage points above the US if you think of the labor force participation as sort of in its correct place in February 2020. So does this mean that like 8.9% is Virginia's true unemployment rate? Not at all. Not at all. In the US and in Virginia too, a lot of the decline is in retirements. And if you think about the trajectory, and I'm going to go back to it in a minute, but if you think about the trajectory of labor force participation, we actually didn't even necessarily decline as much as arguably we should have in 2018 and 2019. But I say this because it is worth state by state examining what underlies the unemployment rate. And, arguably, maybe I should use things like employment to population ratios. Nationally, we actually have an index, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, called the non-employment index, that takes into account people that are out of the labor force. So there are other ways to think about this number. But I'm going back to this labor force participation in the US. If you look at the increase through the 70s and 80s, a lot that's basically women, right? So that was women entering the labor force. Now, women never got up to where men were. But we then saw this decline during COVID. And we're also not back to where we were pre-COVID. Now, if you look at women versus men entirely, like all of them together, I think like we are almost as close to back to pre-COVID as men are. At least it seems to be getting closer every month. But that's not necessarily true for minority women or for women without a college degree. So we can kind of look at this labor force participation and we can think about who are the people that are out of the labor force that were in the labor force and why is that? Sort of broadly, I think that there is evidence that there's some sort of a cost benefit calculation going on of taking the job. So the benefits of the job right now are down, right? In that savings are up, right? So yes, we don't have the unemployment insurance anymore that we had before, but a lot of people have banked, some percentage of that. We've also got the child tax credit. We've got more money available. And income is up, right? A lot of that is from federal relief, at least if you look sort of in the lower income. On the other hand, costs of taking a job are up. So childcare is expensive and it is increasingly expensive. And I have 2 elementary school aged children, and I will say that I do not know a single person in my circle who has not spent time either with a quarantined child, with a child that has COVID, or driving around looking for a COVID test, right? So it is not like, like 3 years ago, 2 years ago, where you could just put your kid in daycare and for the most part, be confident that you would be able to go to work. There also seems to be some, culture changes. And, this is, so we have people, we have an entire outreach team. We have 3 regional executives and we have 3 community development field managers who are out constantly talking to the regional executives mostly to firms, and then the community development field managers to all sorts of people out in the Fifth Federal Reserve District. And what they're coming back with really makes it sound like, at least in some percentage of cases, families are just making different decisions. I have not looked at numbers, for example, on single income versus double income households, but I think that might be really interesting to look at. And the wage, there are survey measures of wages that people are willing to take in order to take a job. So the wage at which you're willing to take a job, and those reservation wages have gone up, right? So people need to get paid more in order to be willing to take a job. So again, there's a lot to talk about, and I could probably talk for another like 45 minutes, but I won't. Let me move on here. I said 5 million more people either out of the labor force or unemployed than pre-COVID. And in July, we had almost 11 million job openings. So the job openings rate, which is the dark blue solid line, is the openings divided by the openings plus employment. It was 6.9%. This is by far the highest rate. This is in July, by far the highest rate in the 20-year history of the series. What's more, the differences between the job openings rate and the job hires rate have been larger than ever before. So firms have job openings, but they aren't hiring to fill them. So one possibility is that something has fundamentally changed with the way firms post jobs or recruit, and this is something that we have a couple of economists that are working on, trying to understand, as do other organizations as well. But so it's possible that some of them are not real openings, but we have other evidence that firms are looking for people. And this is not just I think each of us individually has a lot of experience too. The brakes are not working on my car, and in spite of the emergency-like situation, I can't get into any car dealership in the area, in the next, two weeks. So I think those kinds of stories, getting work done on your house, or, going to a restaurant, or, getting an Amazon package in 2 days, sort of across the supply chain, there are challenges finding workers, and we hear that from firms. So, I presented our manufacturing and service sector indices just now. But we also ask a lot of other questions. So we develop indices out of other questions. And this is the question: is it easier, harder, or the same to get workers you need with the necessary skills? So this is the share who said that it's easier, minus the share who said that it's harder. That's that the light blue is manufacturing, the dark blue is services. And you can see that not only is that measure really historically low, it's also lower than it was even in 2018 and 2019, when we were hearing a lot about challenges finding workers. More and more firms are also talking about increasing wages. And that's this index. It's, did you increase, decrease, or have wages stay the same from last month? And what's more, we added in this question in June: is your expected wage change over the next 6 months greater than normal, less than normal, or the same as normal? And we have an increasing share of firms who are reporting that they are expecting wage changes that are above what they would consider normal. Now, that is, I'm assuming that when firms talk about that, they're talking about nominal wages, right? They're talking about, what we see, say, in our merit increases. So this chart is Bureau of Labor Statistics data. It's publicly available data. It is the dark blue is the year-over-year percent change in average hourly earnings, and the solid line is nominal. The dotted line is real. So you can see from that dark blue, that the dark blue solid line, that wages are going up. And in fact, they're going up more than they were, say, if you take pre-2020, going up more than they were, for the prior 10 years. On the other hand, if you look at the dotted line, we've seen price increases, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so the real wages actually are not going up. If you look at total, right, in some sectors there are, right? So I chose leisure and hospitality for this chart because, number one, the number of job openings in that sector has grown more than most other sectors. The only other contender is manufacturing. And number two, it has the farthest to go to get back to pre-COVID employment. So the question is, how much are people increasing wages in leisure and hospitality? And actually, real wages, adjusted for inflation in leisure and hospitality actually grew about 5% year over year. Although note that this is kind of a volatile series. Nominal wage growth was almost 11%. So this is by far the largest growth of the major industry sectors. I said manufacturing job postings also saw a lot of growth over the last year, but the wage growth in that sector was actually one of the lowest. So there are sectors where we're seeing wages increase to attract workers, but that's not necessarily across the board. Okay, so this is again back to that CFO survey. The biggest concerns that firms mentioned were labor quality and availability. And sorry about the typo in the availability, and supply chain concerns, right? Though, and then actually concerns about demand went up, but like we've had labor quality, availability, supply chain, and cost pressures up in the top 3 or 4 for a long time. 3/4 of firms in this survey reported having some sort of supply chain disruption. And that could be, sort of availability of materials, shipping delays, production delays. So, not surprisingly, then we see producer prices going up. So, I'm kind of going back and forth, right? So one of the things that I really love about my job is that I get to ask a lot of questions of firms, both through surveys and sort of by being out. And then see how that compares to national data. So I'm kind of going back and forth between survey measures and national data. And of course, this slide deck is available to all of you. But this is the selling prices. This measure here is the selling prices received by domestic producers of goods and services. It's called the PPI. And it's price changes from the perspective of the seller, which is different from the perspective of the consumer, which is what we see in the news a lot. So not surprisingly, those prices are going up, and in fact are going up even more. Firms, a lot of times firms that are selling direct to consumer struggle to raise prices too much for consumers, but they will raise them more for when they're selling to other firms. And so not surprisingly, we see this number up. Now, the question is, how long is this going to last, right? So when we asked the CFO survey firms how long they expect the supply chain disruptions to last, a lot of them were saying, first half of 2022 or second half of 2022. So really, we're looking at least if you, from the perspective of firms, not as many firms are expecting to see supply chain issues resolved before the end of next year. And then we have some that are saying 2023 and later, and then we have some that are anticipating it earlier. But so on the one hand, we're looking at another year of this if we believe what firms are saying. On the other hand, we're not looking at forever of this if we believe what firms are saying. Now, these numbers are actually pretty consistent with our 5th district survey. So this was a question that we asked maybe a month ago. September. This was the September survey. And we asked, are you able to meet demand with supply? Like, can you produce enough to meet 100% of the demand for your good or service? And if you can't, when do you expect to be able to meet demand? So we had, and actually a lot of them, this is actually the people who said that they didn't anticipate being able to meet demand even in the next 6 months, right? So we're looking here too at September 2022 and December 2022 is when the firms who are not currently able to meet demand anticipate being able to meet demand. And then there's also a lot of uncertainty. So I think that 25% of firms that were just not sure, that's worth noting as well. So what happens, I already showed you the producer price index price measure. What happens when we have aggregate demand that is not met by supply? Well, we see price increases, and that is what we are seeing now. So we have had year over year. So the Federal Open Market Committee targets a 2% year-over-year price change, actually not in this measure, actually in the next slide I'm going to show. But we have had in this is the most commonly reported one in the news, the consumer price index. We have had year-over-year price growth above 2% in the CPI since March. The August reading was 5.3%, down slightly from 5.4% in July. If we look at core price growth, core is without food and energy, that was at about 4%. So the question on the table is really about persistence, right? So prices for the most part don't decline, but inflation is not about prices going back to where they were. Inflation is about price growth over time, right? So if we see price growth over time that exceeds 2% for too long, that is what the Federal Open Market Committee is going to worry about. So what are we looking for in these surveys? We're looking for signs of permanent changes in expectations for inflation. So this is another measure of consumer prices. I sort of feel like I have to show both because the other one is the one that's more commonly discussed, but this is the one that the FOMC uses for policy making for a variety of reasons, mostly about sort of some wonky things about how they adjust it month to month and how they define the basket of goods. But how does the Fed judge when inflation is too high? Well, there's a target of 2%, and explicitly prefers this measure. So that's why we've got that 2% line. And the red diamonds are the expectations of the Federal Open Market Committee participants. So for actually last August, Jay Powell announced a change in policy as of last August that will make up for the inflation undershoot. So you can see how price growth was under 2% for a really long period of time. Make up for that with inflation overshoots. So practically speaking, that means we wouldn't raise rates, or the Fed wouldn't raise rates until inflation had settled above 2% for a time. Sort of to make up for the past misses. And I think we're kind of there. We're becoming there, right? So the question is, the key really is to make sure that we don't see the price changes get baked into firms or consumers' expectations for prices going forward, because then we'll have some kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when we ask sort of where we are, where we are in this recovery, GDP growth has been solid, and we are now above pre-COVID levels of economic activity. Employment is growing, unemployment is falling, but we do not have the level of employment that we had pre-COVID, and we have a lot of people that are still out of the labor force, and that's true in the US and it's true in Virginia as well. And then the question is, how long will we see these price increases last? And when are we going to see the FOMC react to those? And there's been a lot of conversation about that. There are a lot of news articles about that, and a lot of conversation about the November meeting. This is, all publicly available. So we also have a lot of resources on our website. This is a way to subscribe to receive email alerts, but also, I was in the habit of doing a last slide with some links and things, but I can't really decide what to put in now. So we've got information on inflation, we've got labor market posts, we have sort of some of the things that I talked about today, the summaries of sort of what our business surveys are saying. That is all on our website. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take any now or to take any sort of later.
Yeah, this is Jojo. I did have one question. Are y'all expecting to see another hit to the employment sector when the executive order goes into effect for the vaccine mandate, or any impact on GDP or tax revenues as a result?
Sure, that's a good question. It's a good question. There are a lot of people that are projecting, so there are surveys out there, would you leave your job if there was a vaccine, if you were mandated to have a vaccine? And, of the people that say yes, there's a percentage that actually won't do that. So there are some guesses out there, like, I feel like I've seen like somewhere between 1% and 3%. That's not the Fed. It's other, forecasting firms or economic consulting firms, other economists that are saying like somewhere between 1% and 3%. I really don't know. Part of it too is, when we talk, so when we talk to firms, and I listen to our regional executives really, really closely, you get a certain percentage of them that are saying, yeah, if I were to mandate a vaccine, I would lose a lot of people. And I can't afford to do that right now. But on the other hand, you have firms that say, if I don't mandate a vaccine, I'm gonna lose a lot of people. I can't afford to do that right now. So exactly how that's gonna play out, I don't know. Okay, I should have started. Of course, these views are mine and not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. Every single thing I said, that disclaimer applies to. And it applies here too. My feeling is that even if we do see some sort of hit, it's not going to be. I think some of these other things are going to, in the end, matter more, right? Our kids reliably back in school? Do we see wages rise to the level that workers want in order to take a job? Do we see, sort of other changes in the labor market? We've been asking a lot of questions about remote hiring. So, a lot of firms are saying, no, we want to stay hybrid. We want a certain percentage of days in the office. But then in order to compete for talent, they're actually hiring remote. And in fact, we have done things like that as well in my shop. So I think some of those things in the long run are gonna sort of matter more. But I can't say for sure. And I haven't seen anything in my space, and that includes other Federal Reserve banks or the Board of Governors that have made projections about any loss to employment based on vaccine mandates. That doesn't mean they're not there, but I haven't seen them.